Hey. All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome to Sacramento Public Library's Authors Uncovered. Before our not one, but two authors come out, we have a great session planned for you tonight on this very hot Sacramento day. Want to make sure that our audience knows what's going on and that you're all connected. I want to thank you for joining this event because we're very thrilled to have Karen Rose, author for her latest book, Say No More, and it's the second book in Karen's Sacramento series. She's an award-winning international best-selling author of 20 novels, including the best-selling Baltimore Series and the Cincinnati series. She's been translated into more than 20 languages, and her books have been on the New York Times bestseller list, the Sunday Times UK list, as well as Germany's Der Spiegel best-selling list. And it's a great evening for us, or great late afternoon for us, because we're committed to bringing you high quality experiences and authors. And we think Authors Uncovered is a way to do that, especially in these interesting COVID times. Authors Uncovered is just one of the things that Sacramento Public Library is offering these days, including virtual story times, streaming teen programs, live homework help, and digital resources for educators. In addition, don't forget that you can access the New York Times and the Sacramento Bee. Our virtual doors are always open for you. Curbside pickup is now available in 26 of our 28 locations. The bookmobile is back on the road, and you can also ask for personal shopping. I have a very recent experience with that. My 18-month-old grandson loves anything with wheels, and I want to give a shout out to one of our librarians, Mandy, who picked out a dozen books for me to take home and read, and each one is better than the last. So take advantage of personal shopping. You might discover a new author like Cara Black, who will be leading the conversation with Karen Rose, and I think it'll be a lot of fun for you. So we have a couple of housekeeping items. Look at your screen and you will see the option Ask a Question. So if you type your question in there, others can vote on whether or not they want that question asked. Usually we try to have enough time so that we can do all of that, though. Also, this event is closed caption, so turn that on if you want to take advantage of that. And our program is also being live streamed on Facebook, so you don't have to be on Crowdcast. You can also join us live on Facebook. You can find us at SAC Library on Facebook and at SAC Lib on Twitter and Instagram. So a recording will be made of this, and it will be available on our website later this week. If you have not read Ms. Rose's book, you can pick up a signed copy with our official bookseller, Face in a Book, and those will be available via mail, or I imagine for pickup as well in El Dorado Hills. We also have ebooks and audiobooks available from the library, of course. And we also really have to thank our publishing partners. You know, libraries really, well, none of us would exist if it wasn't for the great work that all of our publishers do to support us. In this case, it's Penguin Random House, and we're very, very grateful to them for bringing this opportunity to Sacramento. I think it's a great way to cool off during the summer. So let's get started. Remember, ask a question. Facebook Live. If you miss part of it tonight, you can come back and listen to the recording of it later. So I want to welcome Cara Black to the stage. Cara will be leading the conversation tonight. She is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of 19 books in the private investigator Aimé Leduc series, which is set in Paris. Her latest book 3 Hours in Paris was published and released this April. So take advantage of, again, of a double whammy of authors tonight. How's that? Cara's received multiple nominations for the Anthony and McCavity Awards, a Washington Post Book World Book of the Year citation, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Medal de Vie de Paris City Medal, which is awarded in recognition of a contribution to international culture. She's been invited to be the guest of honor at conferences including the Paris Polar Crime Festival and Left Coast Crime. With more than 400,000 books in print, the Aimé Le Duc series has been translated into German, Norwegian, Japanese, French, Spanish, Italian, and Hebrew. Cara, welcome. And I'm so excited about this conversation, and I know you and Karen are just going to have a great time. I'll be back a few minutes before 6 to share the questions that you might not have asked that come from our audience. So again, thank you so much, and I will be going silent now. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you so much, Rivka. And thank you to the Sacramento Library for this opportunity to talk with Karen Rose, whose book just grabbed me, Say No More. And I'm really thrilled. I'm in San Francisco, and Karen's up in the woods somewhere with a beautiful backdrop. And can I just say one thing? Thank you for setting a series of books in Sacramento. This is our capital, and I have loved reading about Sacramento since the Karen K. Shevsky books. There were Mysteries with Cat Colorado in the 80s and 90s. And I don't know if she's writing those anymore, but thank you for taking us to Sacramento again in Say No More. And I know you write, I just want to direct people to your wonderful website, because you have all your books. Actually, there's 24, including some novellas, and you've got them color-coded. So that is brilliant. So we know if it's the series in Chicago, if the character, they're in Philadelphia. And so Sacramento is purple. This is, as Rivka was saying, this is the second in your Sacramento series, though I know we've got Deacon, who was in another city before. But Karen.
Not in this series.
Not in this series, in the others. Okay.
Right. In Baltimore and Cincinnati.
Thank you. Okay. Well, can you tell us about Say No More? Because it just is so engrossing and it grabbed me right away. Can you just tell the readers what they're going to find and the whole setup?
Well, to kind of lead into Say No More. Say No More is the second in my Sacramento series, and the first book is called Say You're Sorry. It came out last year in February 2019, and Say You're Sorry introduces Daisy and Gideon is an escapee from a cult called Eden. And as Daisy and Gideon are racing to catch the killer and Say You're Sorry, you learn a lot more about the cult of Eden and Gideon's escape. You also learn that Gideon has a sister named Mercy who also escaped. And Say No More is Mercy's book. And it's book 2 in this series. And Mercy escaped from Eden with the help of her mother when she was almost 13. And in the time before that, she was abused and assaulted, and her mother sacrificed her own life to get Mercy out. And it's one of Mercy's worst nightmares is remembering the death of her mother, who died to keep her safe. And Mercy had spent the last 13 years trying to put Eden behind her, to not remember it. But some events that happen in Say You're Sorry makes her realize she can't put it behind her. She has to face her past and help the people who are still there to get out. And so Say You're Sorry is Mercy's story. And with the help of her hero, Rafe Sokolov, who's a homicide detective, they chase down Mercy's worst nightmare, the man who hurt her for all those years, and the man that she sees, and she sees whenever she doesn't actively block him out. So Say You're Sorry is Mercy coming to grips with her past, and it is her taking basically charge of her own life back.
It's engrossing. Right away, we're at the Sacramento airport and things happened. I mean, really, it's one thing after another. It's kind of relentless. But why, Karen? Why Sacramento? What ties do you have there? Or how did the story suggest itself to be in that locale?
Well, I always try to pick a city that I feel comfortable writing people's point of view who live there. And I belong to a book group, and that is in California. I live in Florida most of the year, but when I came to visit my book group in California, I would often fly into Sacramento because I have friends in the city as well. So I would fly into Sacramento, see my friends, then drive up to Northern California for my book group. And when it came time to start a new series, I said, I really need to set it in Sacramento. It would be a great place. Plus, Northern California offers so many wonderful places to hide, and the topography of the state is so varied and really so beautiful.
Yeah, and there's also just a shout out to the libraries. I believe there's a. I want to talk about that. I think Deacon goes to the library, Sacramento Library.
Deacon is not in this series. Deacon's in previous series.
I'm sorry.
There's a character who also has a point of view in Say No More, and his name is Amos. And you meet Amos pretty early on, and it's really not a big spoiler to say that he successfully escapes. So a little bit of a spoiler. He successfully escapes. But the first place, and he's overwhelmed. He has not seen civilization in 30 years, and he was a 19-year-old man when he joined the cult. And he's now, 30 years older. He has a small child, and he is overwhelmed with civilization as it has become. But the one place that he sees hasn't changed is McDonald's. And so that's the place where he takes his little girl. And he's relieved that even 30 years later, McDonald's still has Egg McMuffins for breakfast. So that is one thing that hasn't changed in a chaotic world. And so he immediately starts saying, well, I need to find a phone book. I need to find a payphone. But the teenagers behind the counter are like, yeah, you could check the Smithsonian, he's like so old, and they're very rude. Well, a woman comes up to him and says, I heard that they were rude to you. Let me help you. What you really need to do is go to the library. And so she takes him that actually happens in Reno, but she takes him to the local public library where a friend of hers works, and they're able to get him on a computer and show him everything while the librarian keeps his daughter blissfully happy with all the books, because she feels like she's gone to heaven because there are all these books in the library and she could read them all. So that was kind of like me when I was a little girl, when I would walk in, and the library was just such a wonderful place. So the library does factor into the book and helps one of the Eden escapees basically get back in contact with civilization.
Did I read this in an interview that you were a library kid when you were growing up? You were always reading. I know I was, but always reading, because a lot of times people say to writers, oh, did you always want to write? And I always say, well, I read first. I mean, it was all about reading.
Yeah, when I was a little girl and I was good and I cleaned my room, I would get to go to the library. So if I got good grades, I get to go to the library. It was a reward. And I was a tiny little thing, and I would walk out with a stack of books that was way over my head, and just devour them all. The library to me was, it was a really wonderful, safe place that was pretty magical. But I didn't want to be a writer then, because I didn't really think about where books came from other than somebody wrote them somewhere, until I read Little Women, and, you've got Joe, writing in a garret with a single candle. And, I imagine there would be rats and all kinds of things. So I'm like, I don't think I want to do that. So it wasn't until I was much later, I was in my late 20s, when I finally started to write. And even then I only wrote as a hobby. I didn't consider writing to be published until probably for another 8 years. And it was 10 years from the day I started writing for a hobby that I first saw my books on the shelf.
Wow. Is there any book that inspired you beside Little Women? Is there any book that any thriller writer or early suspense writer or mystery writer that you were going,
Well, as a little kid, I loved all the Nancy Drew books, but I was a big fan, and I don't know if anybody except people in my age group know who Trixie Belden was. Yeah. And the thing I loved about the Trixie Belden mysteries was she was a kid like me, and they had this wonderful clubhouse and all these friendships. So for me, whenever I read the book, the thing that is a big sell for me is, are there friendships? Are there relationships? Do I wish I were part of that group? And I wanted to be a Bob White so bad. You know, I learned the club whistle, and I did all of that stuff. So I think it just in terms of creating characters that I want to be family with, I want to be friends with, I would probably have to credit that series.
Wow, about Karen. So what do you feel? I mean, there have been these books about, you know, unlikable characters, unreliable narrators. Do you have anything to say about that? I mean, do you read those? Do you go, I don't know about that? Or
I don't know about those. When I read to escape, and I have to like the characters, or I have to be assured that I will like the characters. If I don't like them on page one, you know, I have to be assured that I'm going to like them. I have to be assured there's going to be a happy ending. And so there's after one author I read, I actually, for the longest time after, I would go to the last page first to make sure there was a happy ending, because this author didn't give me a happy ending. And I invested all of this time and emotion and became friends with the people in the book, and they didn't have a happy ending. And I was like, well, what's wrong with this? And I wasn't going to do that to myself again. My time for reading is very valuable, and I read a lot, but I want to make sure that the books I'm reading are giving me something inside.
Do you read outside the genre? Do you read all different kinds of the genre, like biographies or nonfiction? Or do you kind of go with fiction, or do you read fiction when you're writing or not read it?
I will read. I don't read a lot of biographies or nonfiction, and I really don't. I mean, I read mostly romance books, again, because I really love that happy ending. And when I'm writing, I try not to start a new series or a new book. I may go back to an old favorite. So because that way I can put it down and know that everything's going to be okay with those people, and I can put it aside and then focus on my book. And then when I need to take a break a little bit later, I might go and read a few more chapters, but they're usually books that I have read over and over again.
With Say No More, are you an outliner? Are you a seat of the pants writer? Do you just file ideas away? I'm a seat of the pantser, but
that would actually make me very insane. I outline, but I'm kind of in the middle. I outline, but I know the main points. I know where it starts. I know where it ends. Okay. I know 3 or 4 important things that happen in the middle, but I don't know how I'm going to progress from point to point, because to me, that's the fun. Right. That's the fun of it. So yeah, I always know who the bad guy is. I may not know who all of the bad guys are. I might think people are bad guys and they turn out not to be. But the big bad, I always know. And so in that sense, I am an outliner, but I kind of play fast and loose with the outline while I'm writing.
I like that. I like that a lot. Is there anything that was the nugget that was the kernel of this story that you can point us to? Or
well, it's based a little bit, just a little bit, on a personal experience I had when I was in my 20s. We belonged to a church, and we'd found that the minister had lied about everything. He'd lied about his degree. He'd lied about his ordination. The sermons he gave, he plagiarized from another sermon writer, and he was embezzling a lot of money from the church. And other things that went on, and I could talk all day. What really bewildered me and affected me as a 20-year-old was the fact that I just thought, when he had been exposed, and my brother and my husband and his brother were the ones that found this guy out. Well, I thought, well, everybody's going to be grateful, and they're going to make him leave, and we're going to start all over again with somebody who's not going to lie to us and cheat us. But what actually happened was a portion of the congregation did feel that way. Another portion, almost equal in size, said, well, he said he was sorry. He's a good guy. We should let him stay. And then probably the biggest portion said, we're not here for this. And they all left. So basically they left the first two groups to kind of fight it out. And it got ugly. I saw friendships, people who had been friends for decades since I was a child. I had gone to that church as a child, left and went someplace else, and came back when I met my husband. So I was in college by that point. But people I had known since I was a child who had been friends are now no longer friends. Families turned on each other. My husband and his brother got death threats. I mean, this got serious. And I remember just being completely bewildered and hurt and cynical that people who I had called friends could turn on us like that, and not be willing to look at what was true. And forgiveness is one thing, but denying that it happened, and many of them were deniers. Oh, he couldn't have done that. He couldn't have done that. And it was clear he had completely done it.
You were looking for accountability, right?
Yeah, by his own admission. And it was, to me, as a 20-year-old, it really impacted me deeply that this had happened, that I'd seen it. And it honestly made me a whole lot more cynical than I was back then.
Wow.
Yeah. So when I started to write Say No More, it was really that bewilderment. It was, why do people follow a charismatic person? Because this guy was very charismatic. Why do people blindly follow or willfully ignore what is true because the person is charismatic? And that's where this book came from. That's kind of was the seed that planted in my mind, that ended up, through a lot of author imagination and making a lot of it up, because it's the world that I created for this book. But that's where it started. Wow.
And that happened years ago, but it's always been planted there, and you needed to explore it. Wow, that's amazing. What do you say? I mean, I know a lot of your devoted fans and readers are here, but I'm sure there's some people who are writers, beginning to write, first timers. Any kind of, since you bring up something that seeded in your mind a while ago, anything you can suggest to people who are working on a manuscript, who want to write, who something maybe you wish you knew?
Well, I always tell people, first of all, if you're just starting out, don't write to be published. And I think that was something that really helped me, because when I was first writing, it was a hobby and it was fun, and nobody knew but my husband and a few very close friends. Because I was working in the engineering field at the time, and I thought, well, if they find out I'm writing a book like this, I'm going to get made fun of. And I probably would have, looking back. So I just kept it a secret. My daughters were small. I'd put them to bed. I'd sit down and I'd find out what these people did next. But it always came to the people in the book. So I would say, don't write to be published. Write because you hear people talking in your head and you can't wait to see what they do next. But it always comes back to the characters. And whenever I start a book, I always start with the characters. I start with character profiles, and then the book grows from there. I might have a seed in my mind, but the book grows from the characters. So any advice I would give to new authors or authors who are discouraged, go back, maybe burned out, maybe facing some kind of I don't even want to say the word block, but go back and fall in love with your characters again. And when those people become your friends and you're immersed in their world, then you'll write.
Right. And then what about just giving them trouble after trouble, putting them in worse trouble, and talk about that, because that's great. I mean, that pulls us into reading about that. We care about the character too, right?
That's the thing. If you create, when I first started writing, I wasn't writing thrillers. I was writing probably close to women's fiction, but there was always a suspenseful element to it, and that I didn't even realize was there. And I signed with my very first agent, and she said, you have a suspenseful voice. Have you ever considered writing suspense? And I was like, no, but I'll give it a try. And so what I did, because I'm an engineer and I'm a flowchart girl. I went back and I found an author who surprised me with the ending of her book. Because I'm always the person who's like, I can name that killer in 20 seconds when I start a movie or by chapter 2. And what I realized, because I went back and I looked at her book and I didn't read it backwards, like word for word backwards. I read it chapter for chapter backwards. Because
you started at the end.
Well, I read it already, so I knew I was surprised at the end.
Okay.
But I started at the end and I'm like, okay, I'm going to read this chapter and then the one before it and the one before it to see where does this author drop the clues.
The setup.
Okay. Clues. So kind of reverse engineering it. And what I discovered was they were there in plain sight. What she'd done was she made me care about the characters so much that I didn't stop to look. So that's the thing. It's kind of like being a magician where, you know, like, oh, look over here, but all the action is really happening here.
Sleight of hand, yeah.
So if your characters are compelling enough, readers will be so drawn into their story that they won't try to figure out who did it. And then they're going to be honestly surprised at the end. So again, it keeps coming back to the characters. And yeah, they do go through some pretty hard times. And I'm a really mean author. Sometimes I do bad things that I feel sorry for later because I have to, especially if they're a secondary character. Oh, this one got stabbed. This one got shot. This one got kidnapped twice. And then I'm like, okay, well, now I have to write their point of view. And yeah, that's when it gets a little bit hard. I wish I hadn't been quite so mean to them because then I have to deal with the aftermath and all the trauma.
What about rewrites? Do you write a quick first draft? Do you go slow? How often do rewrites figure in your plan?
By the time I've laid the book down and I've gotten through my first draft, I do revisions because, you know, there might be something in my mind that I wasn't clear enough about on the page. Like I jumped from point A to point D and I didn't show the reader the points in between. I'll go back and fix those. But for the most part, once I write a book all the way through, it stays that way, you know, and I revise as I go.
You revise as you go.
I wish I didn't, but I do.
You do. So can I ask the question I'm sure everyone asks you, people ask me, and what is your writing schedule like? Okay. And I know we talked earlier, sometimes you do 2 books a year, but sometimes it's 1 a year. And how do you handle that? Because I'm total awe. I can only do 1 a year, and that's hard enough for me.
Well, I have friends that write every day.
Yeah.
I don't write every day. I will write a book and then I will kind of just hammer at it until I'm fully engrossed. And then I just write for days at a stretch. I used to when I was younger. I would write for days at a stretch without sleep, but don't do that because that's not smart. I'm better now about taking care of myself, and you know, and my husband's always making sure I eat and I stay hydrated and all those things that I forget about because I'm just in the book. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's been 13 hours and I haven't had any food. So I tend to be a binge writer, and some of that comes from the fact that I wrote my first 6 books when I had a full-time job. And so I would write at night. And I was a teacher. So I would write at night and I would write during the summers. And then I would, I would get the book out and then I would revise it and send it in. But that whole binging, I only have this much time. I'm going to binge as much as I can into it. I think that kind of formed my writing habits at the beginning.
Wow. And talking about research, I'm sure since 2003, when your first thriller came out, and now, your research may have changed. I don't know. Of course, there's stuff online, but, I remember, going right to the library, and actually looking things up, right?
Yep.
And then how much do you feel that you need to be on the grounds, on the ground walking, like in Sacramento, or how does that work?
Well, I do explore the cities. Like Cincinnati, I lived there for 15 years. The Baltimore area, I grew up there, so I knew those cities. Sacramento, luckily I have a friend, hi Amy, and she lives in Sacramento, and I went to visit, and I said I would really like to check out I had a list, and I had all of them plotted out. We should go do and I had them on the map. And so we went to see the FBI building in her family minivan, and we sat outside for a long time because I was just kind of, getting the feel of the place and the mountains in the background. And I think she may be on an FBI watch list now because she's in front of the FBI building too long. So I had to really apologize to her for that. But, yeah, the on being on the ground in the city gives you the flavor of the place. And the Google Earth does a good job with kind of helping you remember. But
Sorry. Oh my God.
I always like to go there and just kind of look around and, again, get a kind of place. What are the people like? How do they speak? What's the when I'm writing a series, I always keep that city on the app, so I'm kind of looking at it every day, so I know what's the weather in August, what's the weather, it's 110 degrees, what's the weather in January, and just so I can factor that into the books as well.
Right. So do you have a Bible, kind of like some people talk about all the characters, what they have blue eyes, or they were married, or do you keep a Bible?
Yeah, my daughter works for me, and she keeps the spreadsheet, and she also tells me when I have used the name too frequently. Apparently, in many of my earlier books, I'm trying to think of the last time I did this. May have been recently, but apparently I had in 3 different series, 3 completely unrelated books, a receptionist named Stacy. She's like, you're not allowed to have any more receptionists named Stacy. So she has been retired, but now because she's also my first line editor before, when I'm still writing the book, and I always throw in a receptionist named Stacy. By the time you guys see it, Stacy's got a different name, but I just throw it in just to peeve her because, what's a mother to do? But yeah, all of the characters are in a database. I can tell and sometimes that's important because you forget something, So sometimes it's as small as an eye color can make a really big difference in a plot.
Is there anything that you wish that you could, if you could go back to your first book, change something? I know you write different series, but is there anything you would want to change, or no?
I think there are things I've learned over the years that I've incorporated that are different now, but I don't know that I go back and change them.
Okay. And what is it? I've just written my first thriller because I've written a series. And for me, it was really scary. I really have to say that. It was like stepping out of my comfort zone. And I mean, it was still in Paris, but it was, during the war, 70 years before. So it was going into another time frame. Has something like thrillers always appealed to you? Do you want to keep doing like short series? I mean, like 3 books in a series. Do you picture these series continuing into long-running series? I hope I'm making sense here. Or do you?
I think that the series are connected through characters, and so I might have a character in my very first series that appears in the most recent one. So in that sense, they continue. But, once I've written the number of books I think I need to write in a city, I pick up and I move on to the next city. And, I'm already in a place now where I'm starting to look at the next city and kind of building it in my head while I'm working on the edits for book 3 for this series. But for example, the son of the heroine in my very first book, who's 14 at that point, and I keep in the spreadsheet, I keep track of ages. So I see how, in book years, how everybody has aged. He's old enough now to have his own book. And so I just finished his book.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's
so, if you read my books from beginning to end, you're going to see that different characters pop up in each other's series. And you mentioned Deacon a few times. He's kind of a fan favorite, and he's a favorite of mine too. But he popped up completely unexpectedly in a Baltimore book. It tried to steal the show because he was just he was kind of an overachieving character. And when he walked onto the screen, I heard the Clint Eastwood music, the flute music in my head. The only time that ever happened. So that's kind of why he's pretty special to me. But when I was starting a new series, I'm like, I promised him that if he behaved, because he kept trying to take over, I would give him his own book. So when I started the Cincinnati series, I just kind of picked him up and I moved him. I had a good reason for picking up and moving him, and that created his family. And then I started building the world around this one character. And I'd also left when I decided I was going to write a Cincinnati series, and my in the book Scream for Me, which is my 8th book, I had a character from Cincinnati. She's the heroine's cousin. And at the end of the book, she goes back to Cincinnati. I'm like, oh, I wonder how old she is and if she's married. So I had to go back and look at my notes and see, kind of build what's happened in her life since then. And between Deacon and his family and this character I'd left behind, her name is Meredith, they kind of become the cornerstones for that Cincinnati series. And so they do pop up in each other's books.
It reminds me of Balzac, Honoré de Balzac, who had the French author. And I went to the museum, and he wrote the Human Comedy, they call it the Human Comedy in French. And he has all the different families. Some character will appear in the next book, kind of like a deacon, and come into another one. And then he actually made a flow chart. They actually preserved it on the wall in the museum where he lived. And he never made any money. He was always escaping creditors out the back door, poor guy. But it was so amazing to see how one character, as you are describing, appears in another book because they had another life. They had they were older. And I just love that. When your agent talks to your publisher, do you pitch it as well? How do you pitch that kind of book?
A lot of times, well, the Baltimore series and the Cincinnati series, I pitched them while talking to my editor. The Cincinnati series I had just signed, the Baltimore series, I just signed with Penguin at the time. And my editor at the time was a woman named Laura Cifelli. And I went to see her, and she kind of surprised me with, well, what's the series going to be about? And I wasn't expecting to have to give her that soon. And one of the things I've been a Law and Order fan forever. And I really love that the end of the opening credits, when you have Lenny Briscoe and his partner, and Jack McCoy and his partner, his assistant DA du jour, and they're walking towards the camera. I said, that's the series I want to write. 2 police officers, 2 attorneys, 2 prosecutors, and them being connected. She's like, I love it. Where will you set it? I was like, I was born in Baltimore. How about that? And she's like, yes. So that's kind of how these things tend to happen organically. The Sacramento series, I plotted out with my writing group, because I wasn't a part of those groups when I was plotting out the Baltimore and the Cincinnati series. But when I started on the Baltimore series, I'd become a member of this writing group, and we all kind of built it together.
Oh, I want to join that writing group. I like that. I love brainstorming. I think that's so incredible. So think about it. What do you, a lot of people say, genre writers, thriller writers, oh, that's just genre fiction. But those are, I know, but look at the New York Times bestseller list, like your book. What's filling that top 10, right? Genre books. But so what do you say to people who say, oh, I don't really read thrillers, but I did pick up yours and I loved it. You know what I mean? Like, you're special. I've heard people often say that, or I picked it up because it's set in Sacramento, or, do you know what I mean?
I say thank you. And there's a lot of other authors that I think you'll love too. Mm-hmm. So, it's one of those where it depends on where somebody's coming from. I used to be a teacher, and I taught creative writing, and I think at that point I had 2 books on the USA Today list. So I was just starting out, but and I had this teenager in my class, and we were talking about genre fiction, and they were like, oh, it's predictable. I'm like, well, of course it's predictable. That's what it's supposed to be, and what I told them was a good author will provide the reader with what they're expecting in unexpected ways.
That's a great line. That's a great line. Yeah.
And you go into a bookstore, and it's divided up by genre, so you know where to go.
Yeah.
And so this young man, he sat on because I was writing romance at the time. I still am. And he sat in the front row of my classroom, and he goes, yeah, well, I'm not going to be writing any 10-cent dime store trash. Those words. And I was like, we had a conversation after class, and I very kindly told him that I didn't think he should be in my class because that was disrespectful. And he later went on to work in a bookstore somewhere. So I hopefully that the books being genre books being what a reader expects in unexpected ways sunk in, because that kind of condescension, that bothers me. But if someone comes along and says, I normally don't read this, but I read yours and I really loved it, I'm like, well, thank you. And by the way, try this person. They all write great books.
Yeah, a chance to convert everyone.
Exactly.
And do you hear from your readers much? Do you have much dialogue with them? Do you take any input in case, as I won't, again, I'll bring up Deacon, but I mean, people seem to love him. Would you consider an idea? I mean, how does that work with you? If it does.
They all tell me who they want. The readers will often tell me who they want to see next and who I've left behind. Yeah. And I've got a queue of books that, I'm working on. And, I'm like, well, they're in the queue. And I can't promise when that book's going to happen because, and I try to write according to my book plan. I have like a 3 to 4 year plan. I've just come to the end of my last 3-year plan and I'm getting ready to start a new 3-year plan. So, I do try to take readers' interest. Because if a reader's interested, it means I was interested when I wrote it. So, and hopefully that came through. Yeah. But, sometimes I will ask questions, especially if it's a term that I'm not sure is understood internationally. So I will ask for questions. Sometimes if I get stumped on a name, like the name of a school or the name of a person, I'll ask for feedback. And then they love to jump in and help.
Wow. So I know you're huge in Germany, and my daughter-in-law is German and in Germany right now. And I know they love creamy, they love crime novels in Germany. And I think it's so interesting that she always buys books in German for her grandmother. Her grandmother could read about Sacramento. I think that's really interesting because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but in a foreign country, when it's really American, and it's really about a part of America, maybe we wouldn't really, maybe it's not New York or whatever. So I think that can have huge appeal. They like regional stories, I mean, maybe you hear that from your German readers, but.
They do. And I am so appreciative of all my readers, my German readers. They do like their crime novels. And I'm very grateful.
Yeah. So tell me about this 3-year plan. How does that come about? I know maybe you don't want to give too much away.
Well, what I like to do is I like to put out, especially now that I'm 25 books into this now. So I have a lot of characters that I've left behind whose stories I would like to tell. And sometimes the readers have requested it. And sometimes I just feel bad that I left them behind and I kind of left them hanging where I may have had an idea for their book, but they're just, the timing wasn't right. So I'm a spreadsheet person. So I'll write down, I'll put down the current series I'm working on, and it'll be, this is when the proposal's due, blah, blah, blah. And I'll put down, my timeline. This is when it's going to come out. And then I'll look at the characters that I've left behind in other series. And, I could probably, I probably have time to write this one in here. And this would be a short one. Yeah, my short ones are never short ones. I lie to myself, and I know I'm a lying McLiar face. So, but I put those in there anyway. And that's just basically the queue. Just kind of looks. It's a 3-year plan, and I kind of like, well, if I want to write this many books over 3 years, this is how quickly I need to write them.
Wow. And you're always talking about character, but also, I mean, especially in Say No More, this is a huge issue, it's about truth, it's about these churches, it's about cults, it's about abusing power and everything else. I mean, there's definite issues in the story, which we haven't really talked about. Is there anything else you want to talk about with, issues in your story? I don't want to give them short shrift.
I like to include diversity in my stories as much as I can. And and a lot of people do that. And I'm grateful, and I'm glad to see that it's improving. One of my areas that I really am invested in is in making sure I've included people with disabilities in my books in a real way. So whether they've had an injury, like Rafe at the end of book 1, he's a hero in Say No More. The end of book 1, he gets hurt, and he gets hurt badly, to the point where all the way through Say No More, he's not sure if he's going to ever be a cop again. And it's all about him dealing with what happens if I'm not, what happens if I have to choose something else? What am I going to choose? And what do I want to do with my life? I personally have a hearing loss. So sometimes you'll find deaf people in my books. There's a book called Into the Dark, and it came out this past November. And the heroine is deaf in one ear, and she signs because her brother's completely deaf. And she is an emergency foster parent. She provides emergency foster care for deaf kids who find themselves suddenly in the system. And it's a huge unmet need.
Sure.
If you think about how scared a child is when they enter foster care, and then nobody can talk to them.
Right.
So I like to include representation like that. So to me, it feels like if it is represented enough in a way that these characters are people who happen to have a disability versus being the disability of the weak book, where the whole plot is built around that. It's a vehicle for making our world more tolerant and more accepting and more open.
And more organic too. Yeah. Yeah. Do you ever see yourself going back to writing romance?
I consider my books romantic thrillers. They all have romance in them.
Right. Okay. Wow. And if you could throw a dinner party up there in the redwoods and invite 3 authors, alive or dead, okay, it's okay, who would you invite? And what would you serve?
Well, I wouldn't serve anything, my husband. If I served them and they weren't dead, they wouldn't be dead. I'm not a very good cook.
No.
I would probably serve them like popcorn and, I don't know, Jelly Bellies, because I have a food allergy, so I can't eat anything anymore. But I think Louisa May Alcott would definitely be one, because she was a body lady. I love reading her story, the story of her, not even just her story, the story of her. And she wrote Little Women, but there's a lot to her story that never gets told, or I didn't know about it until later in life. Gosh, probably Carolyn Keene, who I know who was probably many, many different authors, but of the author who was Carolyn Keene. And I'm trying to think of who else I would ask. Somebody who's alive and who's an author. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that one.
Those would be a great duo with popcorn. I could see them having fun.
Popcorn and Jelly Bellies.
That's great. So when you are writing, a sense of place that is so strong in your stories. So you talked about being in the van in front of the FBI building with your friend, and then noting, the weather and everything. But, when often, I felt that Sacramento was like a character in your story. So place is also a character. And can you talk about that? Because I think that's so important, especially people, who are thinking of writing or working on a manuscript, to make it like a character. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think that this is one of those things like spice. I don't cook, but I know when I've eaten food that's got way too much spice in it, where it kind of overwhelms the flavor of what you're supposed to be tasting. This is kind of like dialogue with what's the word I'm looking for? Shoot.
Seasoning?
No. When you have dialogue and people are way too quick to put in all the if you've got an accent, if a character has an accent and
type you.
That can also be overused. But I think with location, it's important to understand that you don't want to give too much. There's authors who will say, well, he turned left on this road and then right on that. Well, yeah, I'm glad you know the area, and I'm glad you want to prove to me that you know the area, but you just took me out of the book. So the location needs to be a supporting character. in your book, and it can't take over, because if it does, then you've lost you pull the reader out of the book, and that's really one of the worst things you can do as an author. If, for example, in Sacramento, it's really hot in the summer, and it's, it doesn't get cold in the winter, but it's important to know, is there a possibility of snow? Does it ever snow? Minneapolis, I wrote a series in Minneapolis, and people have not been there. It gets hot in the summer, and it is really cold in the winter. So understanding temperature extremes. So when do you want to set a book there?
Right.
The book that I just finished, a lot of it takes place up in Northern California, and in the Lassen area, and that is extremely remote. And you're driving your car, and there's ravines here and ravines there, and it's really, really curvy, to the point where I think I'm a little bit desensitized to it, because I live in the woods and I have a very curvy road that comes up to my house. And I had someone who tried to visit me. They couldn't actually find my house in the woods, but they tried to visit me, and they were like, "Your road is terrifying." I'm like, I didn't think it was so bad, because there's so many roads around here that are worse. But the understanding, there are places in this country where you can't get a cell phone service. And if you're out on the like probably 2 miles as a crow flies is the Pacific Ocean. And there are places on the bluffs where you cannot get a cell phone signal. It just doesn't exist. And you're like, not in these days. Yes, in these days.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up, because you have to have, with the cell phone and with the towers and cameras, how do you work with that? Well, of course, there's dead zones. There's, towers don't work. There's fires. But I think a lot of times, at least people who are writing books now, a lot of my friends go, how can I subvert all this technology? And in my books, I don't have to worry about Facebook. It wasn't around then.
Right. And that's a fun thing too, is because again, part of Eden and part of Say No More is Amos coming out of Eden.
Right.
And he's like, he goes, I had to kind of walk myself through his experiences to say, which of these things weren't here in 1989, and like he goes into a McDonald's, and the door magically, the door, he goes into the restroom, because he takes his little girl into the restroom, and she's like, how do I wash my hands? Because it's all sensor now. So, okay.
That's right. Yeah.
When were sensors were created and invented years and years ago, but when did they come into common use? And would this be something you would know about? And he's like, oh, it was a sensor like at the department store when I used to walk through, and the doors would open for me. And those were in common use in the early 80s. So by 89, he would have had it. So understanding when you do flashbacks, what's available. And I have to laugh because, my early books, I look back and they're like, okay, so it's 2003 and not everybody had a cell phone, cell phones couldn't take pictures. And so you kind of have to go back and look at those early books with what might I change today? Definitely the technology would change. So yeah.
Update it. Yeah. In my books, they still use routers,
Yeah.
Because
that squee, with the dial-up modem, you can have fun with it if you set your book, but you have to be careful.
Right.
Because there are some of us who are old enough to remember the before time.
I get a lot of emails about technology. Did they have cell phones then? I go, well, in Paris, yes, they were, because they went closer, sooner to the technology than we did.
Yes. And I traveled a lot in Europe in the mid 90s, and I can remember, the Europeans, they just, they had whip out their flip phones, and and they would have conversations, and I'd be like, oh, that's pretty cool. I wish I had that.
Pretty cool. Pretty dang cool. So I know that there's a lot of questions awaiting you, things I haven't addressed. So I think Rivka is going to step in here. I don't want to hog all my questions. So I've really, really enjoyed, asking questions that I wanted to know the answers to. So I hope that wasn't too selfish. But I know Rivka wants to come on and put the questions on from your readers.
Okay.
So we can keep talking until she does.
Okay.
We're trying to read everything here. Yeah. So are you watching TV during the pandemic? Are you?
My husband and my daughter watch quite a lot of TV. I kind of just sit and knit, and sometimes I listen to an audiobook. Sometimes I will, I'm like, oh, that's interesting, and I'll put down what I'm doing and I'll watch. But they're listening to a podcast now about Hollywood in the first century of Hollywood. It's really fascinating, and called "You Must Remember This." And so every now and again they'll bring on, they'll talk about an actor or an actress that, that's interesting. But to watch something myself, I don't watch a lot of TV.
I have to say, I watched the Golden State Killer, the story that was, I think, on Netflix. That was incredible.
And very local to Sacramento.
Right.
I think I'd written the first book when he was caught.
Wow. So Rivka, take it away.
Moment of technology.
That's great.
Yes. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Then we're good. Thank you. These IT guys, they just want to run your life, but they're awesome. So thanks, guys. So we do have some audience questions, and I have to ask this one first, Karen. It comes from Karen, and she asks, how do you deal with the negativity towards our first name, Karen? I am so not that person, and I'm sure you're not either. Does it bother you that Karens are always asking to speak with the manager, etc.? I love that question.
I try to think if we complain about it, we become the person that we say we're not going to be. So I just kind of hope they go on to another name at some point.
We have a Karen who works with us, and she's the best person in the world. I'm just giving a shout out to all the great Karens out there. So this is from Tracy. I want to make sure I'm asking it correctly. So who was the author that inspired your writing that you read backwards?
Tammy Hoag.
Tammy Hoag.
Tammy Hoag.
Okay. H-O-A-G.
H-O-A-G. And I think that book was, it was her Ashes and Dust to Dust series. And I told her this at one point. I met her at a conference, and I said, and I told her, very quickly, and she kind of laughed. She says, well, when you figure it out, me, because I don't know, which made me laugh.
Great. Is it difficult to write about so much brutality towards women?
Yeah. And it is. And you kind of have to walk the line between making it be just titillating and gross to making it be about a statement. And I continue to get emails from women who have read my books and are grateful that they have a voice, that, I kind of have given voice to how they feel. They don't know how to say it themselves. And, as recently as, just recently, I got an email from a woman who had read one of my books. I usually get this one in my first book, because that was an abused wife who was fleeing her husband. I get a lot of women who've been through domestic abuse who don't know that they're going to be able to read the book, but by the time they get to the end, they're like, that's me. And this woman, she sent me this email, and it was like, I got to the end and I realized, and then it just switches to all caps, that's me. But I survived just like she did. I'm still here. And that just kind of, when you're able to connect with somebody in that way, but it's usually, it's usually showing how these women get their lives back. And that's what I really try to focus on.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you. Thank you for asking the question, too. Is there a topic or theme you have not yet written about or touched on lightly that you would like to tackle?
If there is, it's not popping in my head right now. So, okay. I mean, I'm sure there is. There always is. But yeah, I'm right now. My new series is percolating, and so lots of things are going on up there.
I love this. And I just want to say to both of you, I loved the conversation. I could have listened for another hour. You two are great together. So thank you. I'm so tickled that we get to bring this to our library community. So Susan wants to know how you research the cities where the books are set, the landmarks, the neighborhoods, etc.
Well, some of them I have had personal experience with, like Chicago. My uncle and aunt lived there, and we would go there when we lived in Cincinnati. We would go there for all of our holidays. So, I mean, I kind of was able to scope it out that way. Cincinnati, I lived there for 15 years. So I really know Cincinnati. The whole Baltimore area, again, I grew up just outside of Baltimore, between Baltimore and DC. Some of them have been a little bit more difficult. And sometimes I made up a town because the sheriff was completely corrupt, and I didn't want to get in trouble by, using a completely made up a town.
A real person.
Made up a complete town. But I do visit, and I usually try to find a friend who will show me around, who I can see the town from their eyes. When I started looking at using Philadelphia as a setting, I was a teacher then, and one of my coworkers, I was the math and science teacher, and she was the animation teacher. And so her last name was Ciccatelli, well, still is. And I said, Nikki, I really want to know about your family, because she would, make allusions to this large family that she had. I said, can I take you out to dinner and just tell me stories? And so she did. I took her out to dinner, and we sat there for hours, and she just told me story after story. And as she did, this family starts to take root in my mind, and I could see these pictures. And she told me about, watching parades, because she lived on the Jersey side of Philly, and, watching the parades. And, and then later my daughter went to college in Philly. And so I was really able to see it firsthand. But I did visit. One of our other teachers had just moved back, and she gave me a tour of the day. So I usually try to spend some time on the ground, looking at landmarks, tasting the food. And if I can't taste the food, if I'm allergic to it now, I'll just take my husband, because he likes everything.
Lucky guy.
That's
great. I like this question too. This is from Kathy. What has been your favorite setting? Where do you think your next series will take place? And before that happens, when is the third Sacramento book due to drop? New fans need to know.
Well, I don't really want to talk about the next series, because that's still percolating in my mind. But it'll be a really fun city. I will tell you that. It's a fun city. I've been to a couple times. It's a fun city. Lots of opportunities. A favorite setting. I think I really have loved setting my cult in Northern California. Again, to me, I grew up on the East Coast. So this notion of, we all would think, California, it's just LA. And this notion that there's Northern California, and you hear about the Redwood Forest or the Gulf Stream waters, but you don't really, until you've driven through a Redwood Forest. And it's just so incredibly beautiful. And so I really have liked this setting. And the third Sacramento book comes out in August of 2021. And it is Tom's book. So
not too long to wait. That's great.
Tom was the son of the heroine in my first book, and he comes along and he gets his book, and it's called Say Goodbye.
Excellent. What kind of research do you do for your books? And this is from Aaron. Do you ever have to do medical research?
Yes, and I have a funny story that I think I can tell quickly. I have a friend who is it's not really funny. It's kind of disturbing, but that's right. I have a friend who is an emergency room doctor, and I was the matron of honor in his wedding to my oldest and dearest friend. And they live in Minneapolis now. And so the first time I needed medical help, and I couldn't find what I was looking for online, this would have been around 2003-04 that I was writing Have You Seen Her, which is my second book. It would have been 2003 because the book came out in 2004. And so I called him and I said, I'm really sorry to bother you, and I know you're busy saving lives, but I need a drug that can incapacitate a person within 10 seconds and you inhale. And he said, let me help you. And an hour later, I'm still taking notes. And so he's become one of my favorite go-tos. And he's actually even requested a few things. So he's like, I'm not really sure where that came from, but the nurses in his hospital came up to him once and said, Are you the Contrarado and the acknowledgments? And he said, Yes, I am. So he's got he's had some fun with it. So whenever I have medical research, I usually start online. I kind of, because I don't want to waste his time, but I try to form my questions. I know police officers that I've met over the years. If I don't know, I send an email to the PR person who's in that city, like how many police officers who are women, how many female detectives do you have on your force? And the PR person will answer that question with no problem. But one of the story about with my doctor friend is I was visiting them in Minneapolis, and my 6th book had just come out, which is set. No, it wasn't set in Minneapolis. I've gone for a signing. That one was set in Chicago. I'd gone for a signing, and he said, "What do you want to do while you're here?" I said, "I would like to see the morgue," because you can't just walk in the morgue and say, "I want a tour." Especially, at least you can't in Tampa, because it's like a big thing. So, he's like, "Let me see if I can handle that." So he called and he said, "I would like to have a tour," and I have an author friend who wanted, and all I wanted to see was the lab. Because all I knew from the morgue lab was what I'd seen on Quincy reruns, It's not that different. But what I was expecting was the woman would sit down with me at a table and I'd ask her questions, and we'd leave. And we'd take a half an hour of her time. We were there for hours because she was friends with my doctor friend. And she's like, "How come you haven't come to see me earlier? We get most of our clients come from you." And because he's an ER doctor. And so they went back and forth, and we're walking. I didn't want to see an autopsy. She says, "Well, how about the cold room?" So I saw the cold room, and I saw the room where they prepare the bodies, and I went through, but then they started talking and they forgot I was there. And we had seen this one room, and to this day, this still kind of haunts me. It was her pride and joy. It was her big achievement. And she'd gotten the grant to put together, but it was the room where the families would go to view the bodies, of a deceased, or was there deceased. And she had made it look like my living room. Wow. And it had, because she said that it was for the dignity of the family. So they would have a place to sit and grieve and not be in this sterile, bright white, fluorescent light kind of a room. And in the thing that still haunts me is there was a rocking chair in the corner. And that was where mothers got to hold their babies for the last time. And it just, got me. And I was trying so hard not to cry. And then I just started blindly following them. And they went up these stairs. And all of a sudden we're in the autopsy viewing suite. And there's an autopsy happening. And that was the one, I thought it was a little disrespectful to see somebody when they were dead without their, like all these
permission.
The peeping Tom kind of looking at these people that are dead. And it was a scene I will never forget. It turns out that it was a particularly gruesome death at that. And the body was on the table, and the Emmy was completely gowned up, had the goggles, the whole bit. There was a police officer, a uniformed police officer, standing off to the side, arms behind his back, just kind of, in the kind of the ready stance. And he had this stoic look on his face, like there was no expression there. And I remember thinking, I didn't think they used Cabbage Patch dolls to teach, how to do an autopsy. And the other part of my brain said, "You idiot, that's a body." No, it's not. Yes, it is. And I remember this conversation, kind of this disassociated conversation in my head, until my friend who had come with us, the wife of my doctor friend, and she, in the back, and I had stopped breathing. I had gone sheet white, and I was about to pass out. I had stopped breathing. And I think that the two doctors felt bad because I had never seen a body outside of a casket at the funeral home before.
Yeah.
I hadn't. Wow. And they felt a little bad because they forgot I was there. But that ended up becoming, because I started to think, everything that happens in my life, or even your life, if you tell me the story, can become a plot line in a book. And I thought, I am an adult and I don't know this person on the table. And I still had this dissociative experience where I was like, no, I'm not seeing, my brain couldn't handle it. So it made up a picture that
Mm-hmm.
of what it was seeing. And I thought, what if I was a child? And what if I knew the person? How would that,
Right.
what would that be? And that ended up becoming a scene in the book called Scream for Me, where the heroine sees, it's a memory that she has buried so deep because it was so traumatic, but she remembers it as a dream, and she remembers it as these two people carrying this big doll. And then she realizes it wasn't a doll. It was a body, and you find out whose body it was. But yeah, I mean, little things like that, the little details that you pick up when you talk to a professional, whether they be a medical professional, law enforcement, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I get my best resources when I make a mistake, because I had made a mistake in one of my books, and the medication that I had cited was not available in capsule form, which was critical to the scene. So I get this email from this lovely pharmacist in Chicago who says, hate to tell you this, but this medication isn't available in a capsule form. And I wrote back and said, thank you. Will you be my resource from now on? And so when I needed to know, how would someone buy syringes that weren't traceable? How would you do that? Or how is this drug done?
Yeah.
Or,
that's great.
So they become my resources.
That's fantastic. And I'm looking at the clock, and I think Crowdcast shuts us down. And we would be remiss if we didn't thank both of you. Karen, your storytelling is incredible. Cara, you're the perfect person to have done this conversation. It was riveting, and I'm sure for the entire audience. And everybody out there, you'll be able to capture or catch the recording of the entire Crowdcast sometime within the next few days. We'll send a notice out. I just want to thank you both so much for sharing yourselves with Sacramento Public Library. It was a great, great event. Thank you.
And thank you, Cara.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Cara and Karen.
Bye.